First, I'd like to thank all the conference organizers because you guys have done a great job. This is a memorable experience for me, and having been involved in dissident-related matters since 1996, this has kind of reinvigorated me. For a while, I was kind of feeling post-dissident, I guess you could say, but this has kind of got my energy back up again, and I'm feeling pretty darn good about things. Let me start by telling you my own personal story, my own journey toward dissidence. I'm 49 years old. So I came of age as a gay man pretty much at the same time that AIDS made its entrance. And like so many others, AIDS drastically changed my life. First, it was because so many people I knew died. For a number of years, one of my New Year's Day rituals was to go through my address book and cross out the names of all those guys who had died the previous year and remember them. By the mid-90s, when I stopped counting, I'd drawn lines through the names of nearly 100 people. Some of these were just acquaintances, people I'd met at parties or interacted with during my involvement with various organizations. Some were friends, the guys I'd go for a beer with at the bar, the teammates on my tennis team, or the fellows in my running club. And a few of them were dear friends, men I loved like brothers and whose absence I still feel today. I was around a number of these men through their illness, and one thing was very obvious to me early on. Guys who appeared in good health got sick really fast when they began taking AZT. And I resolved early on, if my time ever came as a gay man and I tested positive, I would never take the drugs. Well, 13 years ago this month, that time came, and when I was taking a routine physical, my doctor said, "Got some bad news for you, you're HIV positive." Well, that was a shock to me because my only possibility of exposure, given my sexual history, was about 3 years before. So that meant I'd already been infected, if I was indeed infected, for about 3 years. So telling that to my doctor, he said, "Well, since you've already been infected for a while, we need to get started on the drugs pretty fast." And I said, "Well, let me think about it." And he tried to persuade me otherwise, and I said, "Why don't we do this? Let's do a T-cell count. I'll come back, see what the numbers are, and then we'll go from there." 2 weeks later, I came back for that T-cell count result, and my T-cells were over 700, about 725 I think it was. And I thought, great, I'm in pretty good shape. Well, the doctor said, and I've never heard any other doctor say this since, he said, "Well, 700 is about 70% of what your normal T-cell should be, so you're definitely going down." And so he said, "You need to take a triple cocktail right away." And I disagreed, and we went back and forth. And eventually he said to me, "Look, if you don't take these drugs, you're going to be dead in 2 years." So he handed me the prescriptions. I walked out the door, and on the way to the car, I passed by a trash can, ripped them up, threw them in, and never went back. That was 13 years ago. That was the last time I went to a doctor for anything HIV related. And luckily, I haven't had to go to the doctor much for anything, really. The next few months were really difficult. I spent a lot of my spare time reading. I felt like I didn't have any support in the mainstream, so it was kind of on my own. I had to be my own advocate and take care of my own health. So I spent a lot of time reading. I was on the internet, and really by stroke of luck, I saw Dr. Duesberg's book, which had recently been published. So I picked it up in my local gay and lesbian bookstore and read it cover to cover in one sitting, and a lot of things suddenly became clear to me. And I felt really satisfied and vindicated in my decision not to take the drugs. Then I began to reach out and try to connect with other people in the dissident community. I called Christine Majori, just went through directory assistance, and found her number in Los Angeles and called her out of the blue, and we had a great conversation, and she couldn't have been sweeter. She connected me with about 4 other guys in Atlanta, which is where I was living at the time, and together we started a HEAL chapter, HEAL Atlanta chapter. And we were very active for about a year. We had monthly meetings, we screened documentaries, we just had get-togethers where we just talked. And our very first speaker was Dave Raznick. We flew him down one time and he spoke for us. Thank you. And that was really my involvement for a while. In 1999, I decided to move to New York. And at the urging of Christine, a few years later, I started an Alive and Well affiliated support group, essentially. It wasn't much more than that. We really just had about 20 people who would get together once a month and talk and share our concerns. Julie, right here in the chair there, she's a member of that group. But being an AIDS dissident or a rethinker wasn't something I really ever wanted to be. And being here in front of you right now is really not something I ever aspired to do. I don't mean that to say that I'm ungrateful for the honor of standing in front of you. It's just that being gay, being HIV positive, and being a dissident isn't the easiest life in the world. Okay? The gay community is already a small community to begin with. And when you set yourself apart by being an HIV/AIDS dissident, you have a community that's this big, And so you learn very early on to be circumspect about who you tell what. And so it's tough. It's very isolating. And that's why when I moved to New York, I started that group. And that was really to kind of give me some support. It was not just for the other people, it was for me too. I needed that support. And it got me to wondering, though, why do more gay men not embrace dissidents? Well, there are a couple of obvious answers, really. The HIV/AIDS propaganda machine is so big, especially in the gay community, that getting over that hurdle, getting past all those ads, the PR campaigns, the marketing campaigns, all the educational efforts that are targeted at us in the gay bars, in the gay and lesbian community centers, and the subways in New York. It's all there every day. You can't escape it. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, don't you, Ed? Yeah, it's all there. So for anybody, for any gay man to really start to question, really takes a huge effort because you have to overcome all that propaganda that you've been fed for the last 25 years. And so it's surprising to me that more gay men, as many gay men as do begin to question. But some do get past all that propaganda and they start to ask questions. And that can be pretty difficult because think about it, when you start to look at all the information that's on the internet, all the dissident related things, it's kind of difficult to sort through it all and make sense of it, especially for those of us who are, we're laymen, we're not scientists, and there's a lot of very technical stuff out there. But another problem, something that I encountered early on, which it's a little bit indelicate, but I'm going to say it. There's a problem, I think, with some of the alternative theories about what immune deficiency is in the gay community. I think there's some things that haven't been uncovered. I think there's some, oh, sorry. Okay. No, I think there's some puzzles, pieces to the puzzle that have been left undiscovered. And around 2005, based on my experiences, by that time I'd known dozens of gay men, dissidents in fact, who weren't using recreational drugs, who were not using the antiretrovirals, yet they still developed what were essentially AIDS-defining conditions. And I kept seeing this over and over and over again. And it occurred to me that there must be something else going on. I'm not a scientist, but I began reviewing the literature. I began reading as much as I could. And I came to formulate a hypothesis, essentially. And that's what I'd like to spend the remainder of my time telling you about. The hypothesis I'd like to share with you, I call the intestinal dysbiosis hypothesis. Essentially what it asserts is that severe alteration of the normal gut flora with beneficial bacteria being depleted and pathogenic microbes favored underlies much of what is called AIDS as it appears among some subsets of gay men. Now, you've probably heard the saying that there's no original thought. When I came up with this idea in 2005, I came up with it on my own. I thought it was all my idea. Well, it turns out that it's not original at all. Back in 1996, Ukrainian scientist Vladimir Kalyadin, who I think you know, David Crow, yes, he had written a paper that was published in Continuum. And that paper was titled Destruction of Normal Resident Flora as the Main Cause of AIDS. And when I read it, it was pretty much saying exactly what I'd come to conclude myself, just based on my own reading of the literature. Gut flora, in case you don't know, are pretty much essential to our health. Some have even called them the forgotten organ. And our intestinal tract is home to trillions of microbes from hundreds of different species. In fact, in terms of actual numbers, there are more bacteria in our bodies than actual human cells. In a sense, we're more bacterial than we are human. These flora evolved in a symbiotic relationship with us over millions of years, and both metabolically and in terms of their contribution to our health, they should be looked at as a virtual organ, one which some have called the forgotten organ. There's several benefits that these bacteria confer in terms of health. One of them is that beneficial bacteria compete with pathogenic microbes such as Candida albicans for space in the gut. Gut flora also produce nutrients such as folate, vitamins B12 and K, and make other nutrients such as zinc and selenium more bioavailable. Gut flora are also involved in the production of glutathione, the body's master antioxidant. Intestinal microflora also help maintain and regulate the gut barrier function. Think of the lining of the intestines as a coffee filter. When it's functioning properly, only the coffee gets through and the grounds don't make it through. The gut flora are kind of involved in that process. Gut microbes directly stimulate and shape the immune system. The interaction between intestinal flora and our immune system begins shortly after birth as we inherit our flora from our mother, primarily from breast milk. But throughout our lives, these flora keep our immune system primed and directly affect certain aspects of immune response. So what happens when beneficial intestinal flora are severely reduced in number? Well, 4 things. Ubiquitous microbes, fungi in particular, that are normally held in check by commensal flora emerge, resulting in opportunistic infections. The key point to keep in mind here is that a number of the principal aids in finding illnesses early on were fungal, candidiasis and PCP, for example. Another problem that you would expect in intestinal dysbiosis is multiple concurrent nutritional deficiencies. This is kind of a hallmark of HIV/AIDS. There's so many different things that people with HIV/AIDS are deficient in. B12, folate, selenium, zinc, the list goes on and on. So this is an expected consequence of a dysregulation of intestinal flora. Another expected consequence is that the gut becomes more permeable than normal, allowing antigens to enter into circulation, causing hyperactivation of the immune system. This leaky gut condition is observed in AIDS, and the increasing severity of it appears to be correlated with disease progression. And the chronic activation of the immune system that results from it is a hallmark of AIDS. Some have proposed that the increased production of antibodies, a condition called hypergammaglobulinemia, that comes with abnormal permeability, possibly plays a role in being reactive on the so-called HIV test. A 4th consequence is that immune abnormalities begin to appear, including changes in lymphocyte composition and number. This, too, is a hallmark of HIV/AIDS. A large and growing body of research supports the connection between intestinal abnormalities and AIDS, and a couple of fairly recent studies have offered very strong support to the intestinal dysbiosis hypothesis. In 2006, researchers wrote, "Circulating microbial products, probably derived from the gastrointestinal tract, are a cause of HIV-related systemic immune activation." A 2008 study asserted that intestinal impairment in HIV-positive individuals is associated with alterations in gut microbiota, and alterations at the gastrointestinal tract level are a key factor in HIV pathogenesis. This particular study was notable because it was the first that compared levels of microbes, both beneficial and pathogenic, in HIV-positive and HIV-negative individuals. Here's what they found. 92% of the HIV-positive individuals had Pseudomonas aeruginosa in their gut, compared to 20% of the general population. And what's more, the levels of this microbe was 10 times higher in the HIV-positive crowd. And this one is pretty stunning. 100% of the HIV-positive subjects had Candida in their fecal samples, compared to 40% of the general population. The levels of this microbe was nearly 10,000 times higher in the HIV positive individuals than in their negative counterparts. 10,000. Okay, and let's talk about the beneficial flora. The amount of bifidobacteria in the HIV positive group was between 25% and 50% of that found in the general population, whereas the levels of lactobacilli were nearly undetectable in the HIV positive subjects. Okay, why should gay men be especially vulnerable to changes in gut microflora? Well, before I go into it, this is going to include a fairly frank discussion of gay male sexuality. So if anybody is going to be offended by that, you can run screaming from the room now. There are three possible reasons. Antibiotic usage to address STDs is conceivably higher in populations that are most sexually active. In his 1996 paper, Catalyzing argued that broad-spectrum antibiotic usage was the culprit. But there are other things that I think need to be considered, things that perhaps someone like Catalyzing wouldn't recognize because he's not a gay man. Rectal douching. This is a common practice among gay men in preparation for receptive anal sex, and this directly affects the flora in the colon. Some people have had trouble when I explain this to them grasping the concept that this could be harmful. They think, it's water, what's the problem? Well, look at it this way. Gynecologists routinely tell women not to douche, use vaginal douches because it upsets the flora in the vagina and it makes them more susceptible to infection. Exactly the same thing is happening with men here. There have been a few studies that address this, not that many, but a couple that I was able to find are pretty notable. A 1985 study concluded that our findings suggest that frequent enemas may predispose to infection and immunodeficiency in some homosexual males. A 2008 study found that douching was a very common practice and was performed by 96% of the HIV-positive gay men in that particular study. Something else that needs to be considered are sexual lubricants, many of which are hyperosmolar, which means they cause the skin to dry out. There are not a lot of studies about that either, but one fairly recent one had this to say. It found that many of the commercially available lubricants dried out the lining of the colon. Astroglide, which is the top-selling brand worldwide and one targeted to gay men, was described as highly hyperosmotic and resulted in severe irritation and tissue damage. Think about it this way. If the ecosystem in your gut is a rainforest, rich in species and interdependencies, these activities, antibiotics, rectal douching, and the use of lubricants are the equivalent of loggers coming in and cutting down all the trees. And that's what's happening. And these are not uncommon practices among gay men, and they're not isolated. They happen regularly over time. Nobody's ever talked about this before, to my knowledge. Something else that's not talked about too much either is that there are fairly extreme versions of anal sex, which some subsets of the gay male community participate in. And so along with the more extreme versions of anal sex come more exaggerated versions of what I'm talking about. So this particular group has historically been seen to be most at risk, and I think there are very good reasons for that. Championing an awareness of the role of intestinal microflora in health and illness, I think, is a great way for rethinkers to reach gay men in a meaningful way. I don't imagine that these ideas explain everything that's called AIDS among gay men, but I do believe it's an important factor that's been overlooked by rethinkers. It's been my experience that once I explain these concepts to other gay men, they get it. It makes sense to them in a way that other alternative theories haven't. And for some, it's a very powerful, eye-opening awareness. And it's my hope that this furthers the discussion. Thank you.